At 0647 local time on April 23, 2025, the USS William P. Lawrence activated her automatic identification system upon entering the Taiwan Strait, a move akin to deliberately provoking a sleeping dragon. 53 miles away, at a Chinese airbase, a radar operator immediately recognized the signal. The scramble alarm shattered the morning calm, jolting two J-16 pilots mid-T. It was Chinese Navy Day, and the Americans had seemingly crashed the party. The pilots sprinted towards their fighters, knowing the critical minutes needed to warm up the twin engines. Ground crews were already removing the safety pins from 4 PL-10 heat-seeking missiles and 2 PL-15 radar-guided missiles. This loadout was significant. These were air-to-air weapons, not anti-ship missiles, a calculated demonstration of how close China was willing to get to an American warship. Close enough that, with YJ-83 anti-ship missiles instead, the Lawrence would be facing imminent destruction. Inside the Lawrence's Combat Information Center, the spy radar painted a detailed picture of the morning traffic. American jets, a China Airlines flight ascending from Taipei, and the usual fishing boats dotted the strait. The Aegis combat system fused this data, providing a comprehensive view within a 250-mile radius. But by 7 a.m., 2 new fast-moving contacts would appear, heading directly towards them. The geography of the Taiwan Strait, narrowing to just 130 kilometers at its most constricted point, made this confrontation inevitable. The Lawrence navigated these waters, threading between territorial limits. The destroyer's radar detected the Chinese fighters from over 200 miles, but the rules of engagement remained clear. Weapons free only in self-defense. By 6:52 a.m., both J-16s were airborne, climbing through 10,000 feet. The weapons systems officer in each fighter ran abbreviated checklists as the 35,000-pound aircraft accelerated. Hydraulics checked, navigation aligned, weapons hot. The Type 1475 active electronically scanned array radar booted up in seconds. Its 1,760 transmit-receive modules worked in perfect synchronization, making it a formidable threat. Unlike older systems that broadcast broadly, the Type 1475 could focus its energy with laser-like precision, painting the American destroyer while remaining nearly undetectable to others. American pilots called it the Ghost. You might not know it's watching you until missiles are inbound. On board the Lawrence, the SLQ-32 electronic warfare suite diligently cataloged every electromagnetic emission within hundreds of miles. Fishing boat radars, civilian air traffic control signals, cell phone towers, and now, something new. 2 airborne radars operating in the X-band, with a pulse repetition frequency that screamed military fighter. The system captured each emission, building digital fingerprints as a sailor enabled every recording system on board. At 7:11 a.m., the lead J-16 pilot executed a sharp roll at 20,000 feet, diving towards the ocean where his radar indicated the American destroyer should be. Through his helmet-mounted display, the ship appeared as a radiant target in the electromagnetic spectrum. He corrected his roll, pushing the nose down harder, trading altitude for speed. Leveling off at 500 feet above the waves, he began his attack run. This was a masterclass in calculated aggression. The J-16's combat computer ran continuous intercept calculations, updating every tenth of a second. In actual combat, his PL-15s would engage from 120 miles away, far beyond the Lawrence's defensive systems. But today's objective required something far more dangerous: getting close enough to prove the kill could have been made. The physics of this maneuver were brutal. At 500 feet, the J-16 flew through the densest air possible, maintaining 450 knots. The twin Saturn engines consumed 400 pounds of fuel per minute. A single error, a moment of inattention, could turn the $70 million fighter into a wreck at the bottom of the sea. his targeting pod, a WMD-7 electro-optical system locked onto the destroyer's superstructure. The image stabilization was so precise that he could discern individual hull numbers despite the turbulent air. The pod fed data directly to his helmet display: distance, closure rate, time to minimum separation, all calculated to demonstrate maximum threat with minimum risk of international escalation. Meanwhile, the Lawrence's defense systems were in a state of heightened alert. The spy radar tracked the incoming fighter while simultaneously calculating firing solutions for the RIM 162 ESSM missiles in her vertical launch cells. The ship's combat system knew precisely which cell doors to open, which missiles to arm, and which trajectory to guarantee a hit. But the weapons remained cold. The Chinese pilot knew American doctrine intimately. He had studied every public document on Aegis's capabilities, memorized the engagement zones of every defensive system. At 3 miles, he was within the minimum range for SM-2 missiles, but ideal for ESSM. At 1 mile, he was inside even that envelope, leaving only the Sea Whiz as a viable option. It was a high-stakes game of chicken being played at Mach 0.7. His wingman maintained a perfect mirror formation 5 miles east, creating what fighter pilots call a bracket. If the destroyer's fire control radar locked onto one fighter, the other would have a clear attack angle, a tactic perfected during the Cold War, now being demonstrated in real time. The message was clear. We've anticipated every scenario, calculated every angle, and your survival depends solely on our restraint. His wingman offset 5 miles to the east, creating a pincer that forced the destroyer to divide its attention. The wingman's radar, in sea search mode, picked up the Lawrence from 45 miles out, a 509-foot rectangle of steel moving at 18 knots. His weapons computer automatically calculated engagement parameters, but these calculations were purely academic. They weren't there to shoot, but to prove they could. If these J-16s were carrying YJ-83 anti-ship missiles, they'd need to close to within 20 to 30 meters for an optimal launch, allowing the missile to skim just above the water. At that range, the crew would have a mere 10 seconds to react once the missile appeared, deploying SM-2s or ESSM. But that wasn't today's game. Ground control vectored them in using data from coastal radars. The controller knew American rules of engagement by heart. They wouldn't shoot at harassment, but approaching from behind provided superior intelligence footage. In the CIC, watchstanders saw their screens light up with new warnings. The J-16's radar had switched from search to track while scan mode, painting them with focused energy every 2 seconds. The Chinese KG-800 jamming pods were warming up, ready to flood multiple radar bands with electronic noise, selectively targeting the frequencies used by the destroyer's fire control radars, potentially blinding them at the critical moment. 20 miles out, the lead pilot spotted a gray smudge on the horizon. He switched his RADAR to standby to minimize warning time and engaged electro-optical tracking. The targeting pod zoomed to maximum magnification, revealing the destroyer in sharp detail despite the morning haze. He could count the radar panels, identify every weapon mount, and see sailors moving on the deck. At 5 miles, the Lawrence's Sea Whiz automatically acquired the incoming fighters. This close-in weapon system, armed with a 20mm Gatling gun capable of firing 4,500 rounds per minute, was the ship's last line of defense. The radar tracked the J-16s precisely, but the weapon remained in standby mode. A single button press would unleash a wall of tungsten, obliterating anything in its path. The lead J-16 stabilized 3 miles behind the destroyer, perfectly aligned with her wake through his heads-up display. The American warship filled his vision. He pushed both throttles forward, igniting the afterburners with a distinctive roar. At 1 mile, he could see individual sailors on the flight deck. At ½ a mile, he could read William P. Lawrence painted across the stern. At 1,000 feet, he thundered overhead at 300 feet altitude, offset slightly to starboard for the best camera angle. The jet wash from the twin Saturn AL 31F engines hammered the destroyer's superstructure. Sailors grabbed rails, bracing against the artificial hurricane. The ship's anemometer briefly spiked to 95 knots before returning to normal. In the CIC, the encounter was logged with professional detachment. Time 7:11 and 34 seconds. Aircraft type J-16. Altitude 300 feet. Lateral separation 50 feet. The Aegis system had already calculated 17 different ways to shoot him down. It's what the system did, constantly computing firing solutions for every track, friend or foe. But this was just the beginning. By 7:23 a.m., a dangerous pattern emerged. The J-16s alternated passes every 2 minutes, one from the stern, one from the beam. They maintained 300 to 400 feet altitude, just high enough to claim compliance if questioned. Each pass was carefully calibrated, close enough to make headlines, yet far enough to avoid an international incident. The lead fighter demonstrated what intelligence analysts call a capabilities display. He slowed to 150 knots, gear up, flaps partially extended, paralleling the destroyer at half a mile. His targeting pod maintained a perfect lock on the bridge while he held formation. The message was unmistakable. My sensors can track you the entire time. The PL-15S under his wings might be air-to-air missiles, but at this range, the demonstration was clear. Had he been carrying anti-ship weapons, he'd be well within the launch envelope. The PL-10s on his wingtips could lock onto targets using the pilot's helmet-mounted sight. Wherever he looked, the missile could track. It's designed for enemy fighters, but the capabilities display made the threat undeniable. The wingman decided to join the act with a supersonic pass at 1,000 feet. The sonic boom rolled across the water like thunder, rattling the destroyer but causing no damage. Bridge windows vibrated, coffee cups jumped, sailors flinched, but kept working. At 7:38 a.m., the tactical picture escalated dramatically. The ship's radar detected a Type 052D destroyer ahead. The Huff, China's most advanced warship, maneuvering to intercept. Simultaneously, 2 fresh J-16s arrived from the mainland with full fuel loads and rested pilots. The new fighters arrived with renewed aggression. The lead pilot began his run from 10,000 feet, building energy for a high-speed pass. These fresh J-16s carried the same air-to-air loadout. 4 PL-10 heat seekers for close combat, 2 PL-15 radar-guided missiles for beyond visual range engagement. But again, the loadout wasn't the message. The proximity was. He leveled at just 200 feet, lower than his predecessors, but still technically within acceptable limits. At 500 knots, the destroyer filled his entire heads-up display. At minimum distance, he was just 300 feet overhead and offset 100 feet to starboard. The Huff closed to 8 miles. Her Type 346A radar locked onto the Lawrence. In her vertical launch cells, YJ-18 anti-ship missiles remained cold, but their presence spoke volumes. These missiles could accelerate to Mach 3 in their terminal phase. The Lawrence would have seconds, not minutes, to respond. The second fresh J-16 executed the day's most aggressive maneuver, a crossing run at 150 feet altitude, just 500 feet ahead of the destroyer's bow. Through the bridge windows, he filled the entire view, twin afterburners painting orange cones against the gray sky. The roar arrived a second later, drowning out conversation and radio calls. The destroyer's commanding officer faced a precisely calculated challenge. Chinese assets surrounded him in 3 dimensions: fighters above, a destroyer ahead, and submarines presumably below. His rules of engagement remained clear. Transit peacefully. Document everything. Don't escalate. At 7:52 a.m., the harassment reached its crescendo. One fighter approached from dead ahead, while another came from the stern, both at 300 feet altitude. The Huff accelerated to 30 knots, rapidly closing the distance. It was a textbook example of coordinated intimidation. Then someone crossed the line. The lead, J-16, dropped to just 120 feet, well below any agreed safety floor, while closing to within 200 feet of the Lawrence's port side. Simultaneously, the trailing fighter executed a high-speed pass just 400 feet above the starboard beam. The destroyer found herself in a carefully orchestrated vice, with Chinese aircraft violating safety limits from multiple directions. The Lawrence's Whiz mounts responded instantly. Both systems locked on and began tracking the jets. The Vulcan cannons spun up to pre-fire rotation speed. The only thing separating this routine harassment from the first shots of a major war was one press of a button. In the Combat Information Center, the tension was palpable. The tactical action officer's hand hovered over the fire inhibit switch. On the screens, two massive radar returns converged on their position with every sweep. For 5 eternal seconds, the future of the Indo-Pacific hung in the balance. The Chinese pilots held their aggressive positions, afterburners blazing, radars locked. The American destroyers' defensive systems strained against their electronic leashes, begging to be released. Then, as quickly as it peaked, the confrontation broke. Both J-16s decided the U.S. won this game of chicken and climbed away at steep angles. The Whiz mounts stopped tracking when they got out of range. Hearts started beating again as the Chinese fighters climbed away. Low on fuel, the Huff altered course to parallel rather than intercept. The Lawrence continued south at 18 knots, her crew processing how close they had just come to a shooting war. How much longer can these calculated provocations continue before miscalculation turns into conflict? This is Goba Military. Subscribe for more real-time battlefield breakdowns and tactical deep dives.